Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who joined this webinar of the IAA. Greetings to all. This is a webinar on the Climate Risk Task Force paper. There's a series of papers which the Climate Risk Task Force of the IAA has produced, and this is the fifth paper titled Climate-Related Disclosures and Risk Management Standards and Leading Practices. My name is Gabor Hanak, and I'm the chair of the Climate Risk Task Force, which I will refer to CRTF. That's an abbreviation for Climate Risk Task Force. And I will refer to the paper as the disclosure paper for short. But the long title is, as I mentioned, Climate-Related Disclosures and Risk Management Standards and Leading Practices. The IA decided about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, actually, in May 2020, to set activities on climate-related risks as a strategic initiative, approved a broad work plan, and created this Climate Risk Task Force to deliver on the approved statement of intent that was approved by the Council of the IA. Since then, 5 papers have been published, and 3 others are in the pipeline for the CRTF. The disclosure paper, the paper which is the subject of the webinar today, is the fifth publication. You can find this paper and other papers that have been published on the IA website. You will find the link, I guess, in the presentation, which you will receive or can download from the IA website as well. In the meantime, we have also published a joint paper with the IPCC, Intercontinental Panel of on Climate Change, Working Group 1, which is called, for short, Summary for Actuaries. This includes summary information about the Working Group 1 6 assessment paper from a point of view of physical risks, and it summarizes an actual perspective. In line with the IA vision and missions, we want to contribute to the global discussion on climate-related issues with an actual insight and clearly show how actuaries can handle complex issues and add values. We also want to inform all interested actuaries around the globe about the efforts made by our task force, by the IAA, and the drafting teams. Not forget about the drafting teams. Each paper has designated drafting teams, and they draft the paper. They take care of the paper under the guidance of the Climate Risk Task Force itself. All authors of the disclosure paper and the members of our task force are excited about the publication of the paper and what kind of impact it will make. So far been hearing positive feedback, but obviously it will be seen on a longer term what's the real impact is. It is by coincidence, but a lucky coincidence, that exactly 1 year ago, so on November 3, 2021, the IFRS Foundation announced at COP26, so last year, the creation of the International Sustainability Standard Board, the counterparty of the International Accounting Standards Board, which is the accounting leg of the IFRS Foundation. And since then, the ISSB, so the International Sustainability Standard Board, has issued 2 exposure drafts, namely S1 on general requirements for disclosure and sustainability-related financial information, and S2, climate-related disclosures. Section 2.3 of our disclosure paper is about the ISSB. The ISSB has the support of the G7 and the G20 and is determined to issue these standards very soon, most probably early 2023. Let's go to the next slide. There are some housekeeping rules can be seen. So all attendees will be muted centrally. while you are listening to the presentations, then you will not be able to speak, but you can use the Q&A function or the chat function as well. But through the Q&A, you can ask questions. I will monitor these questions. And at the end of the three presentations, three of our authors, I will read or let the authors know of the important questions, and they will answer. Time permitted, you can raise your hand. You have a function on so at the bottom of your screen where you can raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, then I will in turn recognize you, and then you will be unmuted and you can ask live questions, as I say, subject to timing. This meeting is recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, then you keep yourself silent or quit. The recording and the slides will be available on the IA website in a few days. Next slide, please. So you can see the authors of the disclosure paper. So the lead author and our first speaker is Jérôme Grignola-Humbert. Then four other contributors: Santiago Fiallos, Darren Fleming, Amanda Latham, and Cynthia Yuan. So today you will hear from Jérôme, Santiago, and Cynthia. So they will speak in turn. First speaker is Jérôme. So Jérôme is the lead author of the disclosure paper, a financial engineer and actuary by background. He specializes in climate risk and sustainable finance. Following a 20-year career in banking, consulting, and insurance, including for the European Union regulator, Jérôme joined Deloitte Switzerland in 2021 to contribute to the development of sustainability services there. Jérôme has wide-ranging experience in climate risk and financial regulation. He focuses on policy, research, and teaching. He currently chairs the Sustainability Working Group of the Swiss Association of Actuaries and also the Sustainability and Climate Risk Working Group of the Actual Association of Europe. So I will pass over the floor to Jérôme at this point and ask Jérôme to deliver his part of the presentation. So Jérôme, floor is yours.
Thank you, Gabor, and greetings to everyone in the audience. Thanks for your interest in the IIA's work, and in particular today, the CRTF's latest publication on climate-related disclosures and risk management. Just to say a few words first, in broad strokes, about what we focused on here. So, as a baseline, what do climate disclosures aim to provide? That's about giving transparency to investors and other interested parties about the potential impact of climate change on a company. That would be, I would say, the outside-in effect, the effect from climate change on a company. But some disclosures can also be more comprehensive and include the opposite, meaning the impact of a company's activities on the climate and the environment, inside out, so to speak. And when you get both, you have a so-called double materiality. Most of what the paper focuses on is to try and help the reader with the multiplicity, I would say the inflation of local and international standards and initiatives on climate disclosures, which are all somehow overlapping, have things in common, but also some divergences, and they have only started to converge, mostly around something I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It's a very dynamic field, and if I may say so, there were parts when we, the authors group, when writing the paper, found it difficult because, let's say, last spring, for example, every week what we wrote was outdated because there was some new initiative, some new proposals, some development in the standards. So we hope that the paper is current, but if I dare say so, I also hope that in a couple of years it will be mostly outdated, because that will mean that all those initiatives and standards will have become mainstream and will have converged around a common methodology. We do have a second area of focus in this paper, which is climate-related risk management. So why did we lump those two related but somewhat different topics together? We think the best reason is that all climate disclosure standards and norms require reporting information on climate risk management first. And through this requirement, in practice, they have contributed at many financial institutions to accelerating or mainstreaming the integration of climate risk into the enterprise risk management frameworks of the companies. Quickly, the content of the paper, which is also the areas which we're going to touch on in this order today. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, a deep dive on that. Some overview of the main other climate-related disclosure initiatives, not all of them because there's too many, so we've selected a few. We've also selected a few leading or sizable countries and their regulations on climate-related disclosures, which we're going to explore with you. As I mentioned, the links between disclosure and climate-related risk management. At the end of the paper, we have also selected a handful, I think 8 companies for which we thought, oh, those are good practices or interesting examples of climate-related disclosures. This covers several regions, continents, and financial sectors, from banking to pensions to insurance. It's important to say that here we did not have some sort of ranking. We just thought, oh, those are good examples. All of them could be better, and there are other good examples that we've not included for lack of time or space in the paper. Finally, this paper comes with a shorter additional document, the glossary of terms and acronyms. This is not something new. This is something that the IAA has done for each CRTF paper. So we've built upon previous versions of this glossary. A glossary that may sound a bit dry and technical, but actually sustainability and climate change are areas where there's a real alphabet soup and sea of acronyms, inflation of definitions. And we believe this glossary is an interesting starting point for people who want to start looking at sustainable finance and climate disclosures, climate risk management, but may feel a bit lost in the again, a real sea of acronyms. And we also have acronyms and definitions as well. For example, we state what's the difference between a carbon neutral and net zero. So we believe this shorter cited document is important as well, and we encourage everyone to have a look at it. Good. So I'll start with what we believe is the centerpiece of many climate-related disclosure initiatives and standards and proposals, which is the TCFD. This is one of the first acronyms after ESG maybe to keep in mind. That's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. This was launched originally in 2015 by the G20 and the Financial Stability Board to develop voluntary, I'll come back to that, climate-related financial disclosures useful to investors and others to better assess the impact of climate change on a company. The real launch, if I may say, was 2 years later, 2017, where the initial TCFD framework was published, as well as practical recommendations. And another milestone was 4 years later, that is last year, 2021, there was a wide-ranging consultation, and the 4th annual report of the TCFD included detailed guidance, including sectoral guidance for financial institutions, banks, asset managers, insurers. A couple of weeks ago, the TCFD released its latest, also the 5th annual report. So this is not info that's included in the paper, that's too recent, but I will quote a few of the recent figures and conclusions that have been published there. Again, I think that's 2 weeks ago. TCFD, before we get into the details of what it is exactly, I would like to stress that it's very influential. To date, it's been adopted by about 4,000 so-called supporters, which may be companies, institutions, and about 500,000 in the financial sector alone, and with a wide geographical coverage, as you can see here. Although TCFD the TCFD framework and principles for climate disclosures originated as a voluntary initiative, we see an increasing number of jurisdictions which are encouraging or even mandating companies to disclose in line with TCFD. So TCFD aligned disclosure requirements have been adopted in, for example, Brazil, Egypt, New Zealand, Singapore, Switzerland, and the UK. And further requirements are under discussions in important in other countries or important regional blocs such as Canada, the EU, and the United States of America. The overall TCFD approach for disclosures is based on 4 pillars. And this 4-pillar structure is fast becoming a global standard for sustainability disclosures, even beyond climate. Later on, we'll say a word about the TNFD, which is nature-related financial disclosures, which has adopted a similar 4-pillar structure. So the TCFD asks companies to disclose climate-related information along 4 categories: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And we'll explore some of those in the next minutes. And there's specific subsector guidance, including down to the level of what should a bank do, what should an insurer do, what should an asset manager do, for example, for the last 3 pillars: strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. It's also important to keep in mind, because we talk a lot about risk, that the TCFD asks companies not only to disclose climate-related information on their risks, but also on their opportunities. It's really, if I may reformulate, what's the financial impact on a company, on a financial institution's strategy and business model, both the negative consequences and the positive ones. Or it's all about risk, if you may define risk in the mathematical sense as variability, both positive and negative. So for example, under risks, classical categories such as transition or physical risks should be looked at, and under opportunities, maybe changes in sources of for production of energy, new products, new markets, how resilient is the company in light of the ongoing and upcoming climate change. The latest TCFD guidance also recommends companies to disclose enough information and focus on their transition plans, and to quantify the climate impact on both sides of their balance sheet. Here, maybe the most striking example would be for insurers. It's not just about looking at just the potential risk of depreciation of stranded assets, or just the physical risks from natural catastrophes. It should really be a holistic view of all risks, and for insurers, impact both the investment side and the underwriting side. Something that will be of interest, I guess, to quants, actuaries, and risk managers the world over is that the TCFD asks companies to, under its 2nd pillar, strategy, to project and look at climate scenarios. There's a recommendation to project at least one scenario with global warming of 2 degrees or lower above pre-industrial averages, and multiple scenarios are encouraged. This is not trivial at all to perform such long-term projections that involve putting together in integrated assessment models, many different models on GDP, inflation, physical risk, financial markets, etc. But guidance is available to some extent. Some has been developed by the TCFD itself. There's also recent interesting guidance from EIOPA, the European Insurance and Occupational Pensions Authority, and by the IAA ourselves. So we've published earlier papers in the series, papers 2 and 3, notably, that deal with climate scenarios. Paper 2 is more about an introduction to the concept of climate scenarios, and paper 3 goes more in the details. And I encourage you to have a look at those papers as well. However, despite this recommendation, the TCFD in its annual report notes that among the many recommendations it makes, so-called TCFD supporters and companies that published TCFD reports do not always comply with everything, and including climate scenarios is the area where there's the lowest level of disclosure. This is progressing, but for example, typically there's almost always in a climate report something on governance, something on strategy. Scenarios, it's not systematically included, unfortunately. even though it should to be called a fully compliant TCFD report. I want to say a word as well on the latest of the 4 pillars, metrics and targets, because it may not be obvious what's meant here. What's the difference between metrics and targets? So targets are typically where does the company or the financial institution aim to be long-term? For example, a given bank or reinsurer may say, I will be net zero across my operations, investment, and underwriting by 2050. That's an interesting target, but that's also very long-term. 2050, 3 decades, that's a whole, I would say, geological era in terms of the financial pace of markets and disclosures. So what the TCFD says, there should be something about targets, but also about metrics, current metrics. For example, how much greenhouse gas emissions is a company currently emitting or financing or insuring? And between those two, current, where you're at now, where you want to go long term, forward-looking thoughts on those metrics. How do the company's emissions or finance emissions or insurance-associated emissions evolve from now to, say, 2050 under different climate scenarios, under different options in the implementation of the company's strategy, etc. So metrics and targets, not just targets. The TCFD, although extremely influential, is not the only, is far from being the only climate-related disclosure initiative. There were others, and as I mentioned, we have not cataloged them all, but we've looked into a few, let's say half a dozen, which we thought particularly interesting. One of them is the oldest of them all. It's the PSI, the Principles for Sustainable Insurance, which were launched by the United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative 10 years ago. It has close to 500 members, supporters, if you want, and focuses on 4 core principles to embed ESG in decision-making and work together with various stakeholders to promote ESG action. And Principle 4 asks companies to regularly disclose their progress on the principles. In practice, you will very rarely come across a PSI report because this is usually, it can be replaced and is usually folded within a general sustainability or climate report. And the UN PSI also sponsors the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, which is another category of initiatives, the Net Zero Alliances, which we've looked at in the paper. I'll start with a quick digression on, or maybe some definitions, because it's not, well, it wasn't obvious to me a year ago, and it may not be obvious to everyone attending today. What's the difference between carbon neutral and net zero? Are those synonyms? Well, no. Carbon neutrality is less requiring. It's defined as purchasing credits for offsetting CO2 emissions released, whereas net zero goes further. It asks companies to first reduce their emissions as much as possible before offsetting, and also consider not just CO2, but CO2 equivalent for all greenhouse gas emissions. So this is more requiring. You could be carbon neutral and still far away from net zero. I'll also paraphrase a slogan from Swiss Re. They say they would do their best, remove the rest. I think it comes close to a very short definition of net zero. So there have been, over the last couple of years, a number of net zero alliances which have been launched, bringing together companies that pledge to be net zero, typically by mid-century or earlier. There's something for asset managers, asset owners, insurers, and those are grouped together under the so-called GFANZ label, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. It's an umbrella organization that was launched last year in Glasgow during the COP26 meeting in Scotland. Another word on net zero for financial institutions, as opposed to, say, manufacturers, for example, the key category of emissions, usually the most material one, is so-called Scope 3 category 15 in the greenhouse gas protocol jargon, which means investment and also insurance contracts. And it's far from obvious in terms of data and methodology to measure those emissions. And there's a standard that's been developed in partnership with PCAF, which you may have heard about. It's the Principles for Carbon Accounting Financials. It's Dutch foundation that's doing pioneering work there. They will actually release in 13 days, November 16th, their protocol for measuring insurance-associated emissions, something I also encourage you to look into. Yet another initiative that's actually already been mentioned in the introduction by Gabor, it's the IFRS Foundation, which has launched exactly a year ago to the day its International Sustainability Standards Board, which focuses on enterprise value. So there's no double materiality, at least not yet. It focuses on the financial impact on the company with a priority on climate topics within the ESG space. It does build upon existing frameworks. There's a lot of overlap on purpose with TCFD, so that you could have a single report ultimately maybe for both. Again, as mentioned by Gabor, there are two so-called prototypes or proposed disclosure standards, general sustainability and climate. And very recently, a few days ago, the ISSB confirmed that Scope 3 emissions, so think of that as including financed and insurance-associated emissions, should be in scope. And 2 days ago, they also confirmed that similar to TCFD, they will ask reporting companies to include climate scenarios. And it aims, this board, the ISSB aims to finalize its standards and publish them as early as possible next year in 2023. I'll now hand over to Santiago to go through the rest of the initiatives we selected and then the national regulations.
Thank you, Jerome. So the next speaker will be Santiago Fialas. Santiago, please switch on your video if you may. If it's possible. Santiago is a fellow of the French Institute of Actuaries. He specializes in assessing life insurance liabilities under multiple standards like Solvency II, internal models, MCV, and French GAAP. Over the past few years, Santiago has focused on current and future European sustainability regulations and market best practices. Santiago is a managing director within the actuarial and quantitative services practice of SIA Partners. Still, I can't see Santiago, but I can now. Okay, so Santiago, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you, Gabor, and thanks, Jerome. So as Jerome mentioned, I will continue with the presentation of other, I would say, other frameworks that are particularly important for actuaries, insurers, and users of financial statements. So first of all, we did a zoom on the paper about taxonomies. So I didn't knew where the taxonomy word came, and actually it's a word that comes from biology. So it's a biologic word or meaning that means making classification. So it's quite easy. We use it for a lot of things, and here in particular we will talk about the taxonomy for sustainable activities. What does it mean? A lot of countries and organizations around the world have decided to set different classification tools to give market clarity on two aspects. First of all, what would be sustainable to support investment decisions, but also what is not sustainable, in particular to fight greenwashing. The taxonomies are generally defined based on very clear objectives. The most common objective currently is the Paris Agreement, and the idea of keeping the world warming below 2 degrees. We will distinguish two kinds of taxonomies. We have the green taxonomies and the brown taxonomy. So green taxonomies focus on what is sustainable and what is currently in the scope or in the trajectory of the objectives. And brown taxonomies focus on high emission activities and try to incentivize efforts towards decarbonization. Green taxonomies are currently much more developed because it turned out that it's easier to say what is already sustainable than trying to figure out how to turn high emission sectors into more sustainable. The most important taxonomies currently is the European Union taxonomy, but we have multiple taxonomies around the world. A lot of countries have been and regions have been working on that. So on the next slide, Jérôme. I think, yeah, great. So we have here a world map focusing on what is the current state on taxonomy development. In blue, we have countries or regions that have currently adopted taxonomies, the European Union. We also have Russia, we have China, we have Mongolia, and Malaysia. And we have another batch of countries that are currently working on their green taxonomy, mainly Canada, Mexico, Chile, South Africa, the UK, the ASEAN in Asia, and Japan and South Korea. This is focusing on green taxonomies, then relating to brown taxonomies. Only a few countries are currently working on that. We have brown taxonomies initiatives on the European Union, on Canada, and in Japan. Another aspect, another aspect together with taxonomy that is very important is the disclosures for financial products, meaning giving information to the users of financial products on the sustainability of these products, and also setting some rules on the specific communication that issuers and distributors of those financial products should include into their communication, and in particular into their pre-contractual information. So in Europe, we have the SFDR, which has distinguished 3 kinds of financial products. We have on the first category products that do not consider any kind of sustainability factors. Then we have distinguished products that promote some sustainability factors. And we have a third category that is much more restrictive on products with sustainability objectives. Just if we can go back, please, Jérôme, to the previous slide. Yeah, great. So once again, here we still don't have, we have seen that there's not a common framework around the world. In particular, on the UK, we have additional categories. So we have something that will be a little bit more detailed, since we are going to separate the ones that do not qualify as sustainability between not sustainable and responsible, to try and give a little bit more of detail, and at the same time the one that has objectives between the ones that are aligned and the ones that have a clear impact. So what will be key here, as we mentioned also previously, is to with the time converge to something that even can be different, be as aligned as possible, as in this example between, for example, the UK and the European Union. Another initiative that we wanted to present is not actually related to strictly to climate, but is the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Why we decided to cover it during this in this paper, and what's the reason we are talking today, is because there are very important connections between biodiversity loss and the climate change. So these two factors are both driven by human activities, and also we have seen over the past decades that they mutually reinforce each other. So it's clear today that conserving biodiversity will be critical to addressing the climate change. So the TNFD has been launched more recently last year, and the aim is to provide a similar framework for organizations to report on nature-related risks. It has been built on the same 4 pillars that Jérôme presented. So in the same structure of the TCFD, meaning we have governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets, to avoid the repetition, but also to accelerate the market adoption of these standards. The idea of TNFD would be to be I would say the sibling of TCFD for the nature related risks, and the idea of these 2 standards would be to be comprehensive in the coverage, because they will cover 2 separate things, but also complementary in their usability and their adoption. Where are we standing today? Today we have a second beta version that has been released a couple of months ago, and it's planned to be finalized in 2023. So next year would be quite important, since both the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, but also the ISSB will publish their final frameworks. So the next section of the paper is to provide an overview of some selected regulations around the world, and to give you an overview of how, first of all, how these regulations work almost on the same way, but also what are the main differences and what are the specific characteristics of them. So we will start with the European Union. So just maybe a word on that. On the paper, we have covered all the countries that are shown in this table, but today we will only focus on a couple of those, and the rest will be present in the paper. So let's start with the European Union. As I mentioned before, the European Union is currently considered, I would say, the most advanced framework. It's a comprehensive framework that has 3 pillars. So these 3 pillars are for the ones who don't know how the European regulation is built. So the European Parliament votes texts that then are applied across the Union. So we have 3 main papers that have been voted, texts. The first one is the Green Taxonomy. So the Green Taxonomy of the European Union is based on 6 clear objectives. First objective, climate change mitigation. Second objective, climate change adaptation. Then we have water and marine resources, circular economy, pollution prevention and control, biodiversity, and ecosystems. And according to this taxonomy, for an activity to be considered sustainable, it must contribute significantly to at least one of these objectives, without significantly harming the others' objectives. And they can have also to respect minimum human rights and labor standards. So the taxonomy will give us a first classification of what can be considered sustainable and what activities are not. Maybe 2 additional details. This text includes in the final version nuclear activities and green gas, since it was considered that these energies were needed to move towards a more sustainable environment. But it was a very, it was a big debate at the European level. Then we will have the SFDR. So once that we know what is sustainable, what is not, then we have clear rules on how to disclose that information, and in particular, how to enhance the decision-making process. And for insurers and pension funds, it's related to pre-contractual information, meaning that if an insurer or a pension fund wants to sell an insurance product labeled as sustainable, we have specific disclosure requirements based on the label that they want to use. The third regulation is what we call the benchmark regulation, since in order to communicate on the characteristics of the products, the European Union has launched two benchmarks, the two labels for benchmarks. The first one would be climate transition benchmarks. Those are based on scenarios below 2 degrees Celsius. And we have the Paris aligned benchmarks, that are benchmarks built with activities that would be in line with the Paris Agreement. These benchmarks have strict eligibility criteria, and they will be automatically withdrawn if we have these alignments for more than 2 years. So what is interesting here in the regulation of the European Union is that we will have one pillar for what is green, a second one on how to disclose, and a third one on how to monitor. We can now jump to the UK. So the UK regulation is very close to the European Union one, but since the Brexit, then the UK has taken, I would say, a slight separate path. So the UK is focusing on the TCFD mainly, and over the next years, the UK expects to have full compliance with the TCFD. So this compliance, it's being built progressively based on the activities and on the size of the companies. So starting with last year, 2021, all the occupational pension schemes with more than 5 billion pounds and all the trusts, but also banks and premium listed companies were expected to comply with the TCFD. Then for 2022 would be occupational pension schemes with more than 1 billion, and also the largest asset managers in particular. And by 2025, we expect the UK expects all companies to be compliant with the TCFD. There is currently a taxonomy also in development on the UK that will be largely inspired by the taxonomy of the European Union. Let's now move to the United States. So the particularity of the United States is that we have three different levels. At federal level, we wanted to point out two initiatives. The first of all, in May 2021, President Biden asked the Treasury to present a plan for improving climate-related disclosures. And on 2022, the SEC, so the Security Commission, has done some proposals for mandatory climate reporting rules for listed companies with scopes 1 and 2, and in some cases also scope 3. Then we will have the National Association of Insurance Companies, the NAIC. So all insurers that have premiums that are bigger than $500 million are asked to produce an annual insurance climate risk disclosure. And this disclosure, starting with 2022, will be aligned with the TCFD framework. And in particular, in California, the response to this survey will be made public. And then we have some specific examples on different states. So 15 states out of 50, but that represent 80% of the gross written premiums, will have committed to use the NIEC survey. And then the state of California, with companies with more than 100 million of gross written premiums, have been asked to publicly disclose their investments in oil, gas, and coal companies since now more than 5 years. And on the New York State, there is the guidance now on how to manage the financial risks for climate change. So if we now we can move to China. In China, there are 3 taxonomies that are being built for different purposes, and these efforts are coordinated by the People's Bank of China, that issued last year some guidelines on the environmental information disclosure for financial institutions, and these are similar but not quite aligned with the TCFD. And then in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority has drafted guidances for a full alignment with the TCFD. And in particular, they have they have a cross agency, the Green and Sustainable Finance Cross Agency that is steering these texts. And in Hong Kong, we plan to have mandatory TCFD alignment by 2025. We can then move to Japan. Perfect. So Japan is, according to the TCFD report that Jérôme mentioned, Japan is the country with the highest number of TCFD supporters around the world. So the Japan regulation is very, very aligned, very close with the TCFD. In particular, in 2021, last year, the Tokyo Stock Exchange introduced some climate-related disclosures that were built on a comply or explain basis. And by April 2022, these disclosures became mandatory, with companies that are listed in the prime market required to follow the TCFD framework. Another particularity of Japan, the stewardship code, which is optional but widely applied across the market, is requiring institutional investors to build skills and resources to include the sustainability criteria in their management strategies. So as mentioned before, we have more details on other countries, on other practices in our paper, but we now want to focus on the second aspect of this paper, as Jérôme mentioned, which would be the ERM around climate risks. And I will handle now the floor to Cynthia.
Thank you, Santiago. So the next speaker will be Cynthia Yuan. Cynthia is a fully qualified fellow of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, and is also on the elected council member for the profession. She has 20 years experience in insurance industry, mostly in the general insurance area, and specializes in modeling physical risks of climate change. She acts as an advisor for many regulatory projects of China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission on Chinese solvency regime, C-Cross, and asset liability management regulation. She also actively participates in the IFOA's, the Institute of Faculty of Actuaries Sustainability Working Party, and she is a senior risk manager of China Re. So Cynthia, the floor is yours. Please continue the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Garbo. Thanks, Jérôme, and thanks, Santiago. I'm going to talk about two sections, which is ERM framework, which is related to disclosure, and some good examples of the practice. So first is about the ERM framework. Like Jérôme just said, why we need to talk about ERM? Because that is what we need to disclose. We need to take a little bit of notes about what we do, so that we can show to the world that this is what the disclosure is about. A general introduction, a general framework of the ERM is actually publicized by the COSO, which consists of 5 components with 20 principles. This provides a standard approach for ERM and it globally and become standard globally. In order to enhance the ERM risk management within the framework, COSO and the WBCSD have partnered to develop a draft guidance to support organizations to do so. In a supplement guidance, this has no difference from a general principle, but only with a flavor of ESG characteristics. It has 5 sections: governance and culture, strategy, goal settings, measurement, review, corrections, information, communication, and reporting. For the governance and the culture, it supports the board and the management to deal with the ESG-related issue and provide a healthy culture ground for the company. Strategy and the goal sets ESG-related target and how to balance with other business targets. Measurement, including identify, assess, and prioritize risks, and implementing risk response. Then there's a review and a correction to see if our target is missed. But the last but not the least, we have to do the disclosure. That's all the end of the whole process to show what we have done so far. So climate-related risk expanded in whole risk management cycle. Next slide, please. Next slide is about climate-related governance. The integration of climate risk into the governance that normally, according to our observation, falling into 2 broad categories. First is as a part of a dedicated ESG task force. Normally requires a focus a dedicated ESG committee or task force. The work will generally be organized along a cross-functional structure aligned with or inspired by TCFD, with a focus on how companies governance enabled oversight, assessment, and management of climate-related risk and opportunities. A second structure normally is as a part of a general ERM. It will naturally follow the classical risk management process to identify, assess, control, mitigate, and monitor emerging risks with a corresponding disclosure in the general risk report or OSA report. Next slide, please. So how we monitor the climate risk exposure and the materiality. Normally, we have 3 main areas of focus: investment, lending, or underwriting, operation. Investments and underwriting are usually the most material aspects. For investment, we start with a market analysis to identify which assets could be mostly affected by climate change. For underwriting, they can be assessed with a probable maximum loss for different perils and use holistic scenarios and stress test results. For climate opportunities, company can monitor the premium for green products in absolute amount or as a percentage of total premium, use definition of sustainable products based on the international standard and taxonomy. There's challenges doing so, normally including not all climate-related risk may be already modeled in a company's risk framework. And also there's a problem with adequate data and modeling granularity for climate risk exposure and the materiality assessment. Model risk is also another area of focus. Next slide, please. Here's we are going to discuss a bit more about the climate scenario disclosure in OSA. Insurance companies with material exposure to climate risk, both physical and transition, are required to include at least 2 long-term climate scenarios in their OSA base, based on 2 global temperature increase trajectories. One is below 2 centigrade, and other is equal to or higher than 2 centigrade. Normally, this is including 3 sections. First is materiality, second, time horizon, third is climate risk factors. For materialities, insurance companies need to assess whether climate change risks are material. For time horizon, The time horizon should be long enough to cover companies' whole exposure, since the consequence of climate change risk might arise later, for example, 15 to 30 years, than the typical 3 to 5 years business horizon usually considered in OSA. Climate change risk factors that includes insurers to consider all the scenarios and concentrate on risk factors to measure their risk exposure. Next slide, please. In this slide, we're going to show some main regulated climate stress tests to date for banks, insurers, and the pension funds. The country includes the Netherlands, United Kingdom, France, Canada, Australia, and the European Union. The disclosure information, apart from a basic normal information, including the risk included, transitional or physical, projection horizon, and scenarios. In its 2021 stress testing program, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand also included a climate scenario involving 3 large storms to test the resistance of the 5 largest general insurers. In the EU, EIOPA launched in April 2022 a simplified stress test exercise for pension funds, which include the transition risk from climate change based on the disorderly transition scenarios developed by NGFS and with an instantaneous shock on the pension fund initial balance sheet. For insurers, a climate stress test exercise is planned by EIOPA for its upcoming 2024 stress testing cycle, with potential discussion to hold it earlier in 2023. So you can see there's many regulators trying to reinforce these areas of regulation. Next slide, please. So now is actually advertisement time. So among all these requirements, what we can do as actuaries, so what role we can play in the climate risk management. In our summary, we think that there are 2 areas we can do bit work on. First is on the traditional role. We can help with analysis on the impact of climate on premium, claims, and reserving. We can help analyze the impact on asset portfolios, which can be seen in the paper 4 of IAA that is described this in details. We can help analyze the solvency requirement, asset liability modeling, capital management. We can also help with developing new products. We can emphasize on the impact underwriting, which is quite an interesting idea recently. In the emerging areas that we can help in those functions. First is climate value at risk. This is a new indicator which has been used in many companies already, and we found it's very innovative. We can help with preparation with analysis of climate disclosure. We can help raising climate risk awareness by talking to our colleagues and having seminars like this. We can help with continuous education, professional and help with setting professional standards. We can collaborate with supervisors and international bodies on these climate important issues. We can do this equipped with our normal actual tools, including scenarios analysis, stochastic projections, financial decision tools, financial impact analysis, cost-benefit analysis, etc. Next slide, please. This is another slide to elaborate the last point, that actually collaborating with the other stakeholders actually can cooperate or had already cooperated with the following bodies. First is the regulators and the supervisors. We cooperate with national and local different ministries and the public sectors institutions. I would facilitate the Chinese regulators to build the green policies. Second, financial institutions, including primary and the reinsurance and the brokers, banks and the fund managers. And third, we can help with scientific communities, academia and the centers of excellence, including World Meteorology Organization, UNESCO, and International Oceanographic Commission, UNEP, IPCC, etc. We can also help with international development communities, which including World Bank, IMF, Asia Development Bank, Asia Investment Bank, etc. We can cooperate with NGOs and the civil society organization, including Red Cross, OFCAN, environmental NGOs like Nature Conservancy, Environmental Defense Fund, World Resource Institution, World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We can also collaborate with other professional bodies, including catastrophe modeling community, accounting profession as well. Next slide, please. So why do we need to do climate? Why do we need to have a quality climate-related disclosure? Because without disclosure, in-depth understanding and demonstrate in-depth understanding of the potential implication of climate risk, company may face reputational and litigational risks. One example is McVie vs. Retail Employee Superannuation Trust case. A member of the fund challenged the trustee in 2018 for failing to disclose the risks of climate change and for breaching the duties to invest with reasonable care and skill. The case was settled in 2020 with the trustee stating that the climate was a material financial risk to the fund, announcing a target of net zero by 2050 and committing to report in alignment with the TCFD. So this event, although this case was filed in Australia, it has been influential globally on how financial institutions manage and disclose climate-related risk. The outcome of the case, a change in strategic direction from the trustee, demonstrates the pressure that can be put on the decision makers through legal challenges, and actually may take notes of the importance of the good climate-related management and disclosure. So that's a lesson we can learn from this case. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to actually give several examples of the good practice. Like Jerome said, this doesn't mean to be exhaustive and it doesn't mean a comparison either. We just found these examples and I think it's worth to share with everybody. First is Alecta. In 2021, Alecta published its first climate report according to the TCFD framework and held a discussion with a selection of investment companies on the theme of climate. Aviva, a UK multinational insurer, has set net zero targets for all scopes of emissions as early as 2040, with interim target of carbon emission reduction by 2025 and 2030, alongside long-term objectives. They are also using climate VAR for shareholder funds, which is quite innovative. ETAL follows international guidance for its climate and sustainability disclosure. The company joined the UN Global Compact initiative in 2004 and became a signatory of PSI in 2012. ETAL's disclosure highlights the vast diversity of frameworks that currently coexist for climate and sustainability reporting. The effort needs to comply with a multiplicity of standards, in particular for the early adopters. So they have this complication to legacy to carry forward to change. MAIF has set 4 specific environmental targets. Use at least 80% of recycled and second-hand spare parts for motor damages. invest at least 7% of the group portfolio in green assets in line with the EU definitions. Reduce the carbon footprint of the group investment by at least 20% by 2025. Certify at least 60% of operating buildings and directly owned properties with a high environmental quality label. So that's for this 4 company. And the next 4 company, first is a Momento Metropolitan, which is a South African company using the UN's SGD as has formed the specific prioritized goals for economical, social, environmental, and government impact. It has a qualitative scenario analysis, which was used to inform the group's strategy development and help to provide a forward-looking approach. Climate has been integrated into the group's OSA framework to help identify the impact of future changes in economic conditions and other external factors. QBE's climate-related disclosure are integrated into its 2021 annual report. Published in February 2022, the climate section is aligned to the TCFD recommendation. Alongside this annual report, QBE also published a sustainability report that gives further details on climate change, along with some more information on wider sustainability issues. It uses implied temperature rise indicators to guide the investment. QBE is a member of the NZAOA, which is under UN, a net zero alliance under UN, and targeted to be net zero by 2050. Next one is Swiss Re. Swiss Re has introduced an internal carbon price, which is also called the carbon steering levy for its own operation, pricing both direct emission and indirect operational emission, like business travel. Swiss Re plans to gradually increase the carbon price to $200 per ton per tons of carbon dioxide by 2030, which corresponds to the market price it expected at the point in time for high quality carbon removal. Swiss Re has announced in March 2022 an enhanced oil and gas underwriting policy, which excluded the provision of insurance for most new and gas products. And last one is Tokyo Marine. Tokyo Marine set out the limitations and uncertainties which are vital to providing decision useful information for those responsible for navigating their organization towards a low carbon future. It developed a quantitative system to assess risks of climate-related assets. And also it has an original approach to achieve carbon neutrality through mangrove planting projects with NGOs in Asia Pacific area. Okay, that's all from me. I'm going to pass the floor to Jerome again.
Thank you, Cynthia. So I would ask Jerome to wrap up and draw some conclusions very briefly, because we don't have much time for the Q&A. But Jerome, floor is you again, and then we will go to the quick Q&A.
Thanks. I'll sure be quick. So as you've probably got either from reading the paper or this presentation, this is a rapidly developing field. For sure, convergence between all of those frameworks will play out. Integrated reporting will come over the next few years, but it will take a little bit of time. At the moment, the leading reporting standards, like some of the European Union, include the double materiality perspective, meaning not just the impact on a company, but also the impact from a company's activity on climate. Another topic which I'd like to mention in conclusion is this potential discrepancy between long-term targets, say net zero by mid-century, versus immediate action or lack thereof. So here there's there are some significant risk of reputation and be seen as greenwashing. And I may refer you to the paper that the Actuarial Association of Europe recently published on this topic a month ago. And finally, we've talked about ERM, but it's important to keep in mind that discussion is starting in many countries and with many regulators and supervisors, not just on how to integrate climate risk in risk management, but also in an ERM, also in actual solvency calculations and prudential capital requirements. So we expect this to be a big topic over the next year and years. And actually another of the author, Darren Fleming, and myself will do some follow-up work on that for the International Congress of Actuaries next year.
Thank you, Jerome. So the next point is the Q&A, or perhaps answering some of the questions which we have received through the Q&A feature of Zoom. We may not be able to answer all, but let's pick up one about deforestation, which can be a very relevant topic for certain parts of the world. And the question is whether or not it's included in our paper. So Jerome, can you answer this question?
Yes, this is a highly relevant question. Actually, just for a short while when writing the paper, we paused and thought, should we talk about TNFD and nature-related issues? And then the answer was clear, yes, we should at least mention it, even though it's not a primary focus of this paper, because deforestation also leads, among other things, not just to biodiversity loss, but also to carbon sinks, like rainforest turning into not just carbon absorbing, but potentially carbon producing with wildfires regions. For that, we believe the TNFD is one of the key frameworks to look at that. And I also encourage the audience to have a look at two things. The Dutch National Bank has published a wonderful pioneering report last year, no, 2 years ago, called Indebted to Nature, which looks at the dependency of the financial system on nature and ecosystems. And also in terms of NGOs, the WWF is also doing a lot of work in this area to connect financial risk with biodiversity loss and deforestation.
Thank you. There is a question about the relationship between the 1 year view of GI insurers like motor riders and the longer term view of climate change and how they come together, whether or not these short term coverage insurers are impacted by climate change. Would any one of you answer that?
I'm happy to give it a try if that's okay.
Go ahead, please.
This is the main objection, and it's a good one at first sight, which is that short-term, typically general insurance or non-life business, 1 year contracts, why should we care about long-term effects? Well, if in a very narrow short-term risk management perspective, yes, maybe there won't be so much development over the next year, although for property and wildfires, I would disagree, but let's say for motor, okay. But if we don't think just of short-term risk management, but of strategy, and it's interesting to note that the TCFD asks climate scenarios to be performed under the strategy pillar in its 4 pillars, then it's absolutely fundamental, because even though there are 1 year contracts, motor insurers probably don't expect to close up shop in 1 year. So what's going to happen in 5, 10, 15 years out in terms of energy sources? What does it mean for electric vehicles, people's driving habits, etc.? This is absolutely fundamental. It's not just the very short-term risk management perspective, but the strategic view and business transition.
Thank you, Jerome. Perhaps I can add to that our discussions with the representatives of the IAIS confirmed that view, that their supervisor will want to see the strategy of even GI insurers as well. And on the other hand, this finally connects us to our next paper, which is on adaptation. The adaptation gap from an actuarial perspective. That is paper 6, and it was released for consultation. So the exposure draft of this paper was released yesterday, and the common deadline is mid-December. And in that paper, there is some ideas about how even non-life insurers or GI insurers need to build their strategy and practices so that adaptation is considered by their clientele and by themselves. So I think it will be a very important, another important piece of work from the CRTF, the Climate Risk Task Force. And I urge you to get a copy from your member association, or you can download it from the IA website. And later today, the IA will release a statement for COP27, which starts on next Sunday, so in a couple of days, that will express the IAA's opinion on what is ahead of us in terms of our participation in COP27. There will be 2 IAA delegates physically meeting with colleagues in Egypt in November, this first week of COP27. So unfortunately, time's up. We don't have much time to answer other questions. We may want to get back to you with the unanswered questions. I would just like to thank our presenters, Jerome, Santiago, and Cynthia. Thank you for participating. As I said before, the recording and the slides will be available on the IA website. Thank you very much for joining. Have a nice further day. Goodbye.